Welcome everybody to this afternoon's session on story. It's going to be such a wonderful panel. I've been so excited. I've read all the books, I've read all the plays, I've read all the screen things, and I'm really looking forward to talking about it. But first of all, and most importantly, I'd like to acknowledge that we're on Wurundjeri lands and we pay respect to our elders past and present. How wonderful and how lucky we are to be here in this beautiful area. So our guests, I've got a really wonderful collection of guests here, and it was quite tricky to sort of try and fit everything I want to say to them in 1 hour. So let's just introduce these people. I'm sure you know who they are already. We have Michelle de Kretser here. Michelle is the twice winner of the Miles Franklin Award. She's been shortlisted for the Man Booker and the Orange Prize, among many, many other awards. Scary Monsters is her 6th novel, and the one that we'll be mostly discussing today. So welcome, Michelle.
Thank you.
We've got the wonderful Amal Awad here. Amal is a journalist, she's a screenwriter, she's an author, she's a performer, she's also on radio and at Radio National, and she's written 7 books. It's really quite amazing. And the one that we'll be looking at today is The Things We See in the Light. And we have Keir Wilkins here. Keir Wilkins is a wonderful screenwriter. He's a script editor. He's written for Neighbours. I'm sorry it ended.
It's a tragedy.
Yes. Were you sad?
Sorry?
Were you sad?
Oh, it's always sad
Sad.
to say goodbye to something.
30 years, Scott and Charlene.
Had a good run.
He's written for Neighbours. He's been in the development team for Picnic at Hanging Rock and Wentworth, that excellent series about the women's prison. And he's done, among many other things, he's also worked with the beast that is Netflix. So welcome to all our wonderful guests. Thank you.
Yeah.
Firstly, I'd like each of you, if you could please, to give, if you can, a small sort of a quick snapshot of what you're working on at the moment, Keir, and about your books that we're discussing today, please, Amal and Michelle. Michelle, would you like to go first?
Sure. Thank you for your introduction. So Scary Monsters is a novel, but it's a split narrative. And I might just thank you so much. Other way. It can be read starting from either side. And each narrative is told in the first person by an Asian migrant to Australia. But in one of the narratives, which is told by a young woman called Lily, and set in the early 1980s, Lily is now living and working in the south of France. And the other narrative is told by Lyle, a middle-aged man who's living in Australia in the near future in Melbourne. So I might just leave it at that, actually.
Thank you.
Little description.
So you want to know what I'm working on? I'm working on another novel and extending my deadline each week, like a good writer. And I'm actually currently also in the screen industry. I'm doing a director's attachment on a production, which has been an amazing experience. And The Things We See in the Light is an extension of books that I'm going to call it an extension. You can read it on its own. You don't need to have read the other 2 books. And tonally, my books have graduated into something a bit more mature. I think, well, my first one's chick lit. It's unapologetically chick lit. Come to Stereo Stories tonight and you'll hear about it. And then the next book was a bit more of my Nick Hornby phase, and now this is more my Amy Tan phase, let's call it. But The Things We See in the Light is really a coming-of-age novel, but when you're in your 40s or you're about to hit 40. And it's really about somebody who hasn't ever been authentic with herself and the very difficult journey to being truthful about who you are and what your desires are in life, especially when you have been, as you know, the immigrant experiences that we all are born with inheritances and a legacy. And for someone who comes from an Arab Muslim background, I wanted to be able to honour that her legacies were quite stifling and difficult, and she made them worse. And I think that at the same time, I didn't want to pollute the sense that those things are all horrible things or anything like that, that there's value in everything we've gone through in our lives. So it's really what it's about, and there's a lot of chocolate and cooking in it, and that's her journey through which,
And we'll talk about that.
and so that's a whole other thing.
Thanks. Keir?
So as is kind of the nature of working in screen, juggling multiple things because it's such a staggered process. So at the moment, the main focuses are the second season of a series called Surviving Summer, which is on Netflix, which is a series for sort of kids, tweens, about young surfers, young competitive surfers, and a series for Stan that will be out at the beginning of next year called Totally Completely Fine, which is, without giving too much away, about a very sort of famous, it's inspired by a very famous Sydney folklore, and it's kind of a unique twist on that.
Can you tell us, Keir, please, and I said that at the start, what exactly is a script producer and then a script editor? Like, what are they?
Yeah, they're terms that are thrown around a fair bit and somewhat interchangeably.
Do you have an hour for that?
Yeah.
I wish.
Yeah.
The different roles.
So a screenwriter is the person that actually is going to go away and write the episode. A script editor is someone that, as things move into production and the writers of the individual episodes have moved on to their next projects because they're only engaged for sort of short periods of time, script editors and script producers often remain on the project all the way through production to the very end, sometimes into post-production, because things are constantly rewritten and need to change because of budget reasons, scheduling reasons. So I guess the idea is that there's someone who takes a more holistic view, a bird's eye view of the whole project, that is often written by 10 different writers. There is someone who's trying to keep a consistency of voice and tone across the whole
Well, why
series.
do they have 10 different writers then? Why not have consistently someone who knows the story from go to woe? Or
The shorter the run of a television series, there often will just be one writer, but because of the way the scheduling work, it's just impossible for one person to write, 10 hours plus of a series. It means a project would be in development for years before cameras were rolling. So to actually, get things moving a bit faster, we have the writers' room set up, which is, a bunch of writers coming together, working together to break the story, and then sort of plotting it out and dividing it up into episodes, and then each writer will go away and write their individual episode.
it's so interesting.
Yeah, very, very different, obviously, to the sort of, prose novel writing.
Well, we are here to talk about story and different forms of story, so it's really great to hear different perspectives. And on that, Amal, I mean, you've been involved in so many different forms of storytelling and story writing and speaking. Or do you have a form of story that you particularly favour?
We were joking about this earlier. I said the ones that I don't like are probably more prominent in my mind.
And I said, come on, tell us the ones you don't like.
I think I love storytelling as a form in general. I think of it as a tree trunk, and the branches change sometimes and grow large. And I think probably what I love the most, I've always been a film and television person, or film. My father owned a video rental store when I was growing up in the 80s. This is before Blockbuster. He was an original trailblazer, my dad. He had this little video store, and I just loved it. I was in a wonderland, and I knew from then that was my first love, was just the screen. And so I think I love, I think I'm in the process of trying to reset what that love affair looks like, because I was very invested in screenwriting for many years, and it's a very hard road. A lot of it is you spend years in development and nothing ends up happening, whereas that doesn't happen so much with the book. Okay. Unless you've completely not met the brief, it's very unlikely your publisher will say, sorry, this is terrible, we're not going to publish it. You know, they've commissioned you to write the book based on what you've shown them so far. So they're going to work with you to make it what it needs to be, and you know at the end of it you're going to have your baby there. Whereas that's not like that in screenwriting. I've been funded multiple times for screenwriting ideas. I've worked with other screenwriters, I've done rooms, I've done everything, and I still have very little to show for it. And it's frustrating because, so now as I sort of move into sort of upskilling with directing, I feel really excited again, and that sense of potential is there. And I think, for me, I just don't have a favourite, but I could probably say I'm less likely to do audio right now, like radio, for example. But if it was fictional audio, maybe I would do it. So I think for me, fiction. I have non-fiction books to my name with the journalism background as well, and they use the same principles of storytelling. I think what you need, and as long as they have compelling characters and giving them something to do, I'm happy. Like I was teaching a character intensive this morning, and it was all about, you know, you can have amazing characters, but you need to give them something to do. You have to give them a challenge to meet. But also we don't want just plot. So anything that involves a bit of transformation and things like that, those vehicles that allow me to do that, I'm there for it. Yeah, just that sense of, I'm really particularly fascinated by our internal world, and I think it's, how do you make that sing? Because it can be a very quiet thing, and it's like, how do I externalize that? And so like in Things We See in the Light, I did that with food. You know, she cooks and she upskills.
We'll get on to that.
Yes, we will.
Fantastic. Michelle, so much has been said. If I could have your book, Michelle. So much has been written about, and there's been so many reviews, and they're glowing, I must add, about the reasons, perhaps, and for structuring a book in such a way. And I know that when I read Scary Monsters, I read it one way. I read the two stories in chronologically first, and then I went back when I read the book a second time, and I read it from Lyle's point of view, from in the future, and then Lily's in the 1980s, and it was like an echo in my head. I learned new things. I saw new things about the book. I'm really curious, and I know people will be. Why did you choose to do this, Michelle? It's so interesting.
Thank you. I guess a few things came together. One was, you know, as you mentioned, my sixth novel, and wanting to just do something slightly different. Secondly was my partner, who is a French scholar, was writing a book about the Oulipo, who are a group of 20th century French experimental writers. The best known of them is Georges Perec, his novel Life a User's Manual, which, if you have read that, you will remember that it tells a series of stories about people living in an apartment block, and the number of apartments in the block is the same as the number of squares on a chessboard. And the way he chooses which, you know, whose story to tell in which order, he uses the knight's move. So there's an L shape. You go from that apartment to that apartment to that apartment, back up. So you know, playing with form. The other famous book he did was one called, in English, called A Void, which doesn't contain the letter E, which in English, as in French as in English, is the most common vowel. So, you know, all these people all play with forms and constraints. So I guess that was the kind of white noise in our house that was going on.
When I was reading your book and I turned to the other story, remember when you used to go on the cha-cha at the show? The cha-cha? And it reminded me, because you're zipping around, you're being spun around, and suddenly the cha-cha, you're jolted completely to the other side. And it's sort of a thrilling feeling, but it also makes you feel a little sick. And I don't mean that. It sort of makes you feel, makes you feel uncomfortable. And I thought that was just wonderful. So thank you. I'm moving on to my note, because I've got so many notes here. I want to ask, Keir, I want to ask you, and we've talked a little bit about machine. Michelle, can you just quote for us the quote at the beginning of your book again? It's the one about...
it's from Nietzsche. The state is the coldest of our cold monsters.
Did everyone hear that? Could you say that again,
Sorry,
Michelle?
the state is the coldest of our cold monsters.
It's the state, and it's the scariest monster, really,
Yeah.
and cold. And when I was thinking about Keir, and I read that he had worked for Netflix, it kind of reminded me, wow, you know, I actually can put some of these works together. So, Keir, is Netflix a scary monster?
Yes and no. I mean, I can certainly see the parallels to the Big Brother, Orwellian nightmare idea, because they are collecting an enormous amount of data on our viewing habits and funneling that back into how they commission projects. So it's a strange intersection of art and commerce, which is potentially a very slippery slope. But having said that, I guess the flip side is that Netflix has such global reach and has such immense resources that they are able to make so much and tailor what they make to such niche audiences that might otherwise not have their stories told and not have their shows made, because if it had to go out on a free-to-air network on your Channel 7s and Channel 10s, they really need to make sure every show is appealing to the broadest possible demographic. So they're going to make things that are very palatable, whereas Netflix can kind of be a bit more subversive or dive into a subculture. So there's pros and cons, I think, to a machine that size. But yeah, it is kind of, it's been a change in the industry to have notes coming back in on projects that you can tell are very much driven from the data that they've collected. They've worked out that certain things work, certain countries respond to certain genres better, and all of that sort of thing. Or like people are switching off at minute 11 in this story. Why is that? Oh, it's because
That's
this
like
happens.
Lyle's world.
Yeah.
So yes, there is that kind of Orwellian thing about the data collection as well.
And that brings me on to, that's a really good segue to my next question, because if Netflix is looking so much at demographics and audience and who are we trying to hit here and how many, I wonder if do we do that on a smaller scale? Do we as writers, and do you all as writers, when you create something, are you thinking of an audience in mind? Are you, Keir, every time you write?
I think, in screen always,
Okay.
because again, it's that intersection of art and business. You need to convince someone, an organisation, to put up millions and millions of dollars to actually see this thing get made. So which audience are you writing for sort of at the moment then? At the moment, I'm finding myself writing for young adult audiences a lot more.
Are they the people that are watching Netflix the most?
Yes, more so than some of the older demographics, and I think that's also just a genre preference for myself. That's just where I feel most comfortable writing as well. So it's not entirely sort of coming from a cynical sales point of view. It is also what I enjoy writing.
Excellent. Great. What about you, Amal? Do you write with an audience in mind?
Yes and no. Similarly, I think, how would I market this? I don't think I've always cracked the code. I tend to look for what I think hasn't been done, and I don't always recommend that, because being the first to do something you generally don't get noticed, and then it's other people swim in and then you're like, but I did that like 5 years ago. But to give you the example of my first novel, quoting Samira, I absolutely knew it was a chick lit book. Unapologetically, I loved chick lit books, and at the time I did, and I just thought I wanted to know what that looked like with a Muslim character. I just thought, can I do sexy without the sex, basically? And that's a sneak preview of tonight. But I was, and I had to convince people that there was a market in that, and I wasn't hugely successful because they just didn't believe that there was. It
was hugely successful, or it wasn't?
No, I was rejected everywhere. Tonight I will share my wounds. Like I will, it was tough. Yeah, it was really tough. Like, you know, you get told you don't know what people want. You don't I mean, I'm a learner by absorption primarily. I mean, I've done academia and I've done the law degree. I've done all those things. But the best education I can ever get is on the job. And for me as a writer, being on the job means reading. And I would read and read and read books and understand what kept me reading. And I tried to apply it. But it didn't mean, I knew I needed help as an early writer. But yeah, so to answer your question, I think it's very important to understand how would you pitch it. So we call it, you know, the elevator pitch. And that applies whether it's screen or books. And I'm writing a new novel at the moment, and I remember on the show that I'm working on, someone probably just being polite said, "So what's it about?" And I said, "Well, it's this and it's that." And she just sort of looked at me. I went, "I've got to work on that a bit." Like I knew I hadn't nailed it.
Her eyes glazing over.
Hadn't nailed it. No, I just sounded like an idiot because I just sounded, it was about, there's this person and there's another person and then this happens and then I just went away and I was like, okay, this is how you figure it out. You know, I haven't nailed the pitch yet. I don't actually know what the story is. And so it was really valuable to have people put you on the spot like that because, yeah, like, who am I writing this for? In the novel space, I know at the moment I'm writing for predominantly women. And when I wrote The Things We See in the Light, I did say I was really mindful of it not being categorized as chick lit because not insulting chick lit, but it wasn't chick lit. It's, you know, it's a dramatic novel. And they said, no, Amal, this is uplit. And I said, what's that? They said, you know, like, you know, you're in the sort of Tony Jordan area. And I said, okay, all right, well, I'll take that. That's fine. So, you know, there are all these levels within novels. And I mean, I'm not literature, but, you know, all it would take is maybe a different cover without pink. And it would be, do you know what I'm saying?
Make it a lot more depressing.
Sorry?
Make it a lot more depressing, perhaps.
And a different name. I had a different name, and they said, no, that's
is that right?
Yeah,
Okay.
It sounded too literary. So, you know, it influenced. These are the things that you don't realise sometimes is that, you know, and I had this for Fridays with my folks. When people read the book, they said, I didn't think I was going to read the book that I read because of the cover. And I had no choice over that. Like, well, I had an essay, but I didn't have a choice. And they had, so Fridays with my folks is a non-fiction exploration of aging and illness. And my father has a chronic condition. He has kidney failure. So I decided to go out as a journalist and as a daughter and explore, well, what does it mean when our bodies start to fail us? And what does it mean for the people around us? And so it was this quite serious book with some funny moments, but, you know, it's a serious book overall. And the cover is me in a car smiling, going Fridays with my folks. And so people were confused. They were like, this.
Yeah.
So it's not to sort of bash the publisher or anything. That's not what I mean. It's just that they had something in mind and I had something in mind. And I think the same thing happened with Cleopatra, my last non-fiction book. In my past life, I was Cleopatra. Absolutely a book for skeptical believers. It's not a book for people in the new age because they feel attacked by it, which is not what I was doing in the book. But do you see the difference is like, I think from a marketing perspective, I don't know if it was marketed to necessarily the right way. People thought, well, this is a book for new age fans, and it's not because I drill down into it in a way that if that's your thing, you're not going to be happy about that.
Yeah, so audience from a publishing point of view is so important too.
So you don't have a lot of say, and you won't have a lot of say once you've written your screenplay about what happens at 11 minutes. It's just the way it is. There's so many people involved. I would say maybe books you have a little bit more control than the screen industry. The screen industry is just, there's a lot of cooks in the kitchen.
And what about you, Michelle? When you write, do you have an audience in mind?
No, I don't really. Except that I think my readers are incredibly smart.
Thank you.
And no, I mean, actually, seriously, because I think when I read novels, that my favourite kinds of novels leave some of the imagination to me and to work out what's going on, and I don't like everything spelt out in laborious detail.
You're following a story, you're not following the audience, right?
Exactly. And also I think one of the great joys of fiction And perhaps we could talk about whether this is an advantage or a disadvantage in relation to images and film or television. But I think so much is left to the imagination. And so I find that, talking to readers about my books, everyone really kind of rewrites the book and lives a different book and comes away with a different interpretation. Often things that I haven't thought of, and that's sort of so satisfying and wonderful, actually. And so to try and write to a market would have no sense anyway, because I think people just are so different and read. We really, I think a book goes out into the world and then it no longer belongs to me.
Well, the reader is
it
dead.
belongs to
the author is dead.
the author is dead.
Yeah.
The book, when it's, I get a book, they send an advance copy of the first printed copy, and that's thrilling, but it's also rather a sad moment for me, because at that moment, it is an object, it has become an object in the world. I no longer have any power over it. I can't change a comma or, do anything. It's no longer alive to me. It is an object in the world, and off it goes, and it belongs to everyone else. And I've done the work of writing, but yours is the work of reading. It belongs to you. So
it's such wonderful work.
Isn't it wonderful? Aren't we all glad to be reading?
We're also
I really,
we love being readers.
I really resonate with that. I just want to emphasize, I'm the same. Like when I write, regardless of if it's in my awareness who this might be marketed to, I never write it for them. I will always just write the story that I feel needs to be written. And I wonder if that works against me sometimes, but because I'm really stubborn about that. Like I try to be true to the story.
But it sounds as if you've had some mismatches with covers.
No, I love my publishers. I really. No. I think it's about marketability. Sometimes is a mismatch. Maybe, but the stories themselves, you just you get into them, and that's it. It's your world, and then at the end, like you said, the energy is depleted, and there's nothing left to be done. And it's actually healthier to say I'm done. I can't. I think it's unhealthy if we're sort of sitting there worrying about it. And
I think if I could just talk about your books and your writing for a moment, Keir. With in your two books, Michelle and Amal, you have these wonderful female characters, and Sahar,
yeah.
Sahar,
Yeah.
Sahar. I apologise for the
fine.
mispronunciation.
It's okay. I don't expect you to know Arabic names. It's all right.
And Lily. And I'm talking about Lily's story here. And they're both, you manage to capture, and perhaps it's a universal female thing, of fear and loneliness, particularly in Lily's point of view, and the need for friends, for other females around us. And you do that so well. And Lily is in the freezing cold of France, and at night she holds her own hand. And Sahar is and it's in the stifling heat, and she's from Sydney, but it's this incredible heat, and then the cold, and the heat, and the cold, and they can't. Could you speak to us about how is this your own experience that you're writing about, or is this something that you imagine, or I don't know?
All right, okay, I'll go first. Look, I remember when I put the book out, I got my back up a little bit about knowing people were going to think it was autobiographical, and I show you it's not, because our lives are never that interesting as writers. We just get to play, we just get to imagine ourselves as other people, and we bring parts of ourselves to those stories. Absolutely. What is the job other than that? My job is to interpret life as best I can, and I'm constantly pulling at the threads of existence around me and trying to make sense of things. And I was talking about this in the workshop today. Don't ever base a character fully on someone you know. It never works. It's never truthful, because it doesn't work. What you want is what's the essence of that person that you're interested in, and use that in your story. So yes, I'm in there because I think I was trying to make sense of the legacies that I have as a woman who was raised into a particular mindset and family. You know, my parents are Arab immigrants. You know, they're conservative people, but I would say not hugely religious, which was quite confusing for me because religion and culture get so closely intertwined when it comes to the Arab world and Islam. And so for me, I became a bit like Sahar, where I made myself more religious than I needed to be at one point. I call them my fundy days. And I wore a headscarf for nearly 10 years, you know, and I don't have a problem sharing that because I think, I mean, I've written about it a million times, but the thing I loved about Sahar's journey, so she's the third friend in this trio, and I'd never thought I was going to write her book, and then I realized I was avoiding writing her book because I knew it was going to be the hardest one, and that was because she had the most to lose. She was the most religious out of the friendship trio, and so I knew I had to take away the most from her. You know, when people are sort of in the middle and things, they don't have a lot at stake when it comes to their belief systems, whereas her whole belief system crumbled amid tragedy. And so as a result of that, you're taking a person who closeted herself, literally and figuratively speaking, in, she hid herself from the world, and you're taking all that away, and so you strip the person of all of that armor and what's left. And I could relate to that because I had spent my 20s doing exactly that, avoiding life because it was just easier to be afraid and to sort of, and most people can relate to this in some way, they just don't realize they're doing it, you know. So that's how I relate to Sahar. It's actually not so much just the religious aspect of it, of like trying to peel away belief system things that, you know, what still resonates in that and what doesn't. But it was more for me being a woman in this world, being constantly surveilled and told what to do with our bodies, our minds, how to think, how to feel, to be aspirational towards marriage, that if you don't get that, then you failed in some way. I thought my whole life was going to be about marriage and having kids. I'm child-free. You know, there are a lot of things that I've changed about myself over the years that if somebody had told me 15 years ago, this is where you're going to be, I wouldn't have believed it. And so you have to allow for that growth in your life. And that's what the character's story is. It's about her potential.
Yeah, and it's a beautiful character growth too. It's wonderful. Michelle, what about you?
I so could relate to what Amal was saying because it's a time of being a young person, and I, with Lily's story, I started with that and wrote that first because Lily is not me, as you said, but she I've been a young woman a while back, and she's an intellectual, and I could, she was an easier character for me to find a way into. And like Lily, I lived in the south of France at the start of the 1980s. And I was interested in capturing two things. First of all, that state when you've finished university, and if you've done, as I did and as Lily did, a sort of completely non-vocational degree, Bachelor of Arts, what comes next? And that sort of feeling of being in between, not quite a child, not actually an adult. What's next? And it's potential and it's possibility, but it's also scary because you just, you do not know what your life is going to be. And you look at friends who are, lawyers or teachers or whatever, and they seem to have anyway their life worked out. So that sort of in-between age when, you're feeling vulnerable, sort of psychologically. The other thing was being in a place where you know no one, in a foreign country, and at a time when, the only forms of communication were either phone calls, which were so incredibly expensive that, you couldn't afford them unless it was, a life or death situation, or letters, which of course took time. And I think now, looking back, how hard it must have been for parents in those days to let their children go and, just not be able to readily, easily reach
Post-restant. Remember
post-restant? Yes, exactly. And then the other thing was just to do with the time and the place. At the time in Montpellier, the buses used to stop running at 8 at night. So if I went anywhere in the evening, I had to walk to get home because I couldn't afford taxis. And so we're walking through these dark streets, and as a young woman, you know, you're sort of aware of being on your own in a place that, you know, is quite a small city in those days, and went to bed early, and you're walking through these dark, empty streets. At a time also, which was coincidentally, and I put this into the novel, the time when the Yorkshire Ripper was operating in the north of England. And so there was, every day in the newspapers, on the radio, you would hear another story about the Yorkshire Ripper. And I lived in a block of flats, a small block of flats, and as most people still do in France, of course, live in apartments in the cities. And in those days, there were no digital codes. So anyone, unless there was a concierge, which required a sort of slightly grander kind of apartment, concierge to sort of watch who came and went, meant that anyone could enter your apartment. And I, of course, had, you know, a novelist's imagination even back then. And I would think about who might be waiting for me on the stairs. So I would frighten myself in that kind of way you do, partly to preempt anything bad happening. You know, if you imagine the worst, then the worst won't happen. You know, that kind of mental trick. It's like if you take an umbrella, it won't rain. You know, it's so sorry. That's I've gone on too long.
No, it's excellent. How long do we have, please? Have we got enough time? 3 or 4 minutes?
We've got 20 more minutes.
20 more. Thank you. So I wanted to talk, there's lots of things I wanted to talk about because I want to talk to, and so often at writers' festivals and when we're talking to writers, we tend to talk about the more sort of depressing parts or the worrying things or the anxiety-inducing parts of novels. But I want to also talk about how incredibly funny and uplifting your work is, Michelle, in this book, and uplifting your stories of hope. And Keir, in the short thing that I read, Oh Baby, it was incredibly funny. How important is humour? How important is humour in telling in story as kind of a balance or an addition to your work when you write? Because there are some very funny parts. You know, I'm thinking of when, you know, Lily, when Lyle in the near dystopian, the children are called IKEA, and Mel and Sid, and it's just very funny, and they're at the things that they aspire to. And when Lily bows down 7 times to the most beautiful woman in the world with her friend, and the same with you, with some of the food that you write about, Amal, just makes me want to get the recipe right away. The donuts with rose petals garnished on the top and made for this sort of stuff, and how funny your script is. How important is humour, Keir, in your writing?
Very. I think it's the short answer. I think humour is kind of an incredible way to stealthily have a reader or an audience let their guards down.
Is it an essential part of story, do you think?
I mean, certainly there's plenty of examples of things that work that, you know, are humorless or just, you know, incredibly bleak. But I do think that immediately is going to limit the way people approach that work.
Right.
I think they go up with they're bracing themselves to be in for a hard time. And I think you can disarm people with humour in a way that's really helpful to actually poke at something even more truthful or, you know,
yes.
as a way to stealthily get at some bigger issues without putting people
Because
up.
there's different types of humour too, isn't there?
Yeah, and certainly for me, the sort of the darker humour,
Yes.
the humour that springs from tragedy, I think is, you know, an incredibly
absolutely.
powerful.
Yeah, I got that
vehicle.
in your work. Yes, yeah. Amal and Michelle, what about you? How important is humour, or being, or in your uplifting stuff as well? Do you think?
I mean, I think humour is relief a lot of the time if it's a drama. If it's actually a comedy, then the characters should never know they're funny. You know, you're not writing characters like who are aware of how hilarious they are, but the audience is amused by them. So something like Schitt's Creek, let's say, that show, they don't think they're funny. We think they're funny, right? So there's different levels to humour, and I think when you were talking about humorless stuff, really what you want is that moment. Like, you know, this morning I showed a clip from Breaking Bad where Walter White basically tells a bunch of wannabe drug dealers to stay out of his territory. But the way he did it, everybody laughed, and it was really clever writing. And I think it's just very important to me when I write, I always, and what I love, I mean, the feedback I do get is that so many people feel like the way they've described it to me has been very reassuring for me. It's that they felt like it was very meditative and like a hug, and I feel like that's. I can sense that when I wrote The Things We See in the Light, that it sort of plodded along in a way that was like a gentle embrace. Whereas, you know, the previous two books weren't. Like Courting Samira is very funny because she's got an imagination. So it's she just makes really outlandish observations and things, and she's funny, you know, and I think you have to allow for that. Just honour the characters, basically. Don't try to be funny, because even when I said to one of my friends who read my book, I said, it's not that funny. She said, no, there are funny moments in there because she's so serious, the character, and so sometimes what she's really bad at is quite
and her
funny.
friends, of course.
Like the improv scene, for example, she's forced to do improv and she's socially phobic. So it's like the worst nightmare come to life, and she tries to escape. You know, it's quite funny. So yeah, I don't know if that answers the question, but...
Well, I'm just interested in what is humour essential to story? Is it and from what you're saying, that aspects of it are both?
I think it just varies. I think it's hard to, like, it's an essential strand, but it's not. It really, you don't want to force humour.
No.
It has to be something that it's layered in. You know, you don't want to overdo it.
No.
That's all.
Michelle?
Yeah, look, I think you've both answered that so beautifully. I'm not sure there's much I can
In
add.
your writing, I suppose, like with Lyle's story in particular, did you find yourself laughing when you were writing some of those things?
No, I think, no. But
Don't lie, Michelle. Come on, you laugh a little bit.
You're laughing now.
You're laughing now.
I did laugh actually a bit in Lily's story,
Yes.
where so I'll tell you. I mean, it's sort of embarrassing, but Lily has a couple of friends, and they kind of role play being really horrible rich French people, and when they're doing that, the guy they're talking about when they first met, and the guy who's an army officer says to the woman, you were as exquisite as my horse. And that actually made me laugh. I thought, oh, that's good, I'll put that in. Then I never laughed again. Of course, you know, it works the first time and then never again.
Well, it does for us.
Never again. But I think, you know, you ask, is it important? I think, or is it essential to storytelling? I don't think it's essential, but it's a tool in the toolkit, as it were. And one I enjoy using, because again, you know, always we write the book, or I suppose the script that you sort of want, you want to be reading yourself or watching yourself. And, you know, there are many really great writers whom I admire enormously who aren't funny, but the ones I love are funny.
Isn't that interesting?
The ones I love are funny.
So who do you love? Who do you love
Oh,
reading?
Penelope Fitzgerald, for instance, you know, the great British writer. I mean, just fabulous writer.
And funny.
Funny, but, you know, in that sense, also UK, we're talking about the humour that comes from tragedy. And, I mean, you know, I just think she's wonderful. Chekhov is, of course,
Yes.
funny.
Yeah, very funny.
Very funny. But
Margaret Atwood is very funny.
Margaret Atwood's very funny. I think Ali Smith is often
Yes.
very funny. You know, they're sort of humour from situations. They're not necessarily sort of laugh aloud lines. So, yeah, I think it's...
I mean, if we had to talk about... We don't have enough time and we're going to run out, but I wanted to talk about what story is and more essential components of storytelling. But I think what we need to do is have our audience of wonderful readers, if you would like to ask a question of anyone else about story or about their particular books or work, We would love to. I know I've got lots of questions. I've written a whole book on notes on this. Would anyone like to ask a question? Yes, we have one here.
Not on? Oh, here it is. Okay. Hi, I'm a school teacher, and I'm just wondering, how do you create imagination when you start to write? Because I try to encourage my students to be imaginative, but I find sometimes it's difficult to have them open their minds. So what do you do to get yourself going, so to speak?
Keir, what would you like?
Great question. I mean, maybe this is a cheat answer, but consuming other work that I love and that inspires me is just immediately always opens up my mind. Like looking at other examples within a similar territory and going, why is that affecting me? It's sort of trying to understand the magic trick of other stories and going, how have they done that? How have they made me feel that way? In terms of how that translates to the classroom, you obviously can't just play movies and and tell them to watch other people's work. But I don't know. That's always my first go-to.
Helen Garner says that, doesn't she? That she reads a sentence or a paragraph, and then she analyses it closely and says, how did they do that? Why is that funny? Why is that so, deeply impactful? Why? And then she gets ideas from that.
I think one other thing I would add as well, and this is maybe more a tangible tip for a classroom setting, is that looking at a primal sort of human emotion, and I often find that a starting point for me is something that I'm a little bit afraid to look at about myself, an experience that I've been ashamed of or felt guilty about or been humiliated in, something that, sits uncomfortably with me is often a really interesting place to start about, like, why did it make me feel that way, and going from there.
That's terrific. Any other questions?
Could I just add one thing to that? I would say what's really crucial, and this is underrated, is like kids usually know what they like and nobody trusts them. And I was always into film and TV, and I wanted to be an actor, and my mum thought that was hilarious. So she told me that I was wearing the headscarf telling her I'm going to be an actor. And she's like, how is that going to work? I don't even know. I don't remember saying that to her. But now I do acting classes, and I'm like, I'm in my 40s. So it's like, we know deep down, and so like I would always say, follow your curiosity. Things are always going to be a lot harder if you're forcing something, and I always prefer to write from character than plot. Because plot, to me, if you write too heavily from plot, then you're forcing your characters to do something to serve the plot. So I tend to try to have fully rounded characters to work with to show me the way. And so if you can get kids to have that sense of trust that there's something that it's going to take a bit of time, but they just need to work with it. But to follow their curiosity and what excites them, it's really not that hard. Like most kids, I've done workshops with kids, and it took them all of 2 minutes to tell me what they love doing. And they were.
The trick is to get them to write it
down.
down.
Some of them started crying, and the teachers were just looking at me, and I'm like, I'm so sorry. I have no idea what just happened. And I think it's because nobody ever sat down and asked them, what do you like doing? Do your maths homework? There's no sense of that.
Any other questions? Yes.
I was interested in the whole discussion around screenwriting and the fact that you'd have, for certain projects, so many different writers. And I'm a huge fan of Hilary Mantel and Wolf Hall. And I think Hilary is just the pinnacle, absolute pinnacle. And so the absolute excitement we feel when we see the book on the screen translated in such a way that's so gripping. I mean, what are your thoughts on really allowing an author to be the screenwriter? I know it can work both ways.
I think, that's a whole different kettle of fish when you're working with adaptation. I think obviously they know the work better than anyone else. They know those characters, they've lived with them for years, so there is huge value. Sometimes there can be bumps along the road because they're so married to how it is in the book, and that doesn't always directly translate to what makes a compelling television series or film. So that can require some navigation, and it depends how open they are to collaboration. But certainly that's an example of someone who just nailed it. You know, they knew the work better than anyone else, and so they absolutely should have been trusted to lead that adaptation, and it worked out beautifully.
Some writers don't want to write screenwriting. They don't want to actually be screenwriters, so because it's such a craft, but they want to be in the writer's room, and then they can try to steer the story at least. But, you know, there are some authors who are very happy to just, now it needs to live in a different form on screen, and what worked in the book might not work on screen, and it just has to be amplified sometimes. It's hard having the author there, I think, in that way sometimes.
Sometimes, yeah, and it is such a different, you know, how it works on the page is so different. A screenplay is such a technical document more than it is a creative document. You know, it's a blueprint for hundreds of other people to go and do their jobs in terms of production design and costuming. So there's all sorts of considerations, I guess, that a novelist may not be used to factoring into their process.
Another question?
Very interesting talk, thank you. Just wondering about the moral of the story, and also the times that we're living at the moment with lots of issues and social change. At what stage, or if any, during the process of writing, do you have a moral to your story, and you can see that maybe some social change can come through your art?
Oh gosh, thank you. I don't know. I guess I have a moral to my story. I think that's up to the readers to kind of discover that. And again, I think different readers will take away different messages from my books. So I guess there are certain things I want to say or hope I'm saying, but I again really think the interpretation is the reader's work, and I sort of don't want to get in the way of that. Yeah.
Yeah, I wouldn't say I have a moral with my stories, but whatever I begin thinking with is not what I usually end with. So I often start a story thinking that this is what I'm writing, and then by the end of it, it's revealed itself to be something deeper or more meaningful.
Yeah.
And it's not usually moralistic, it's much more about human nature. So, you know, the things we see in the light is very much about authenticity and living an authentic life. Whereas when you look at the veins of the story, you're thinking this is, it's about an oppressed Muslim woman who left a marriage and did all this sort of stuff. And it's actually not. It's about very relatable things that anyone from any culture could relate to. So.
When you're visualising the storyline, how much do you put on the first page towards the draft? Like you say you have it evolves, but how much do you write down to start with to get the overall plot? So, is there a lot of pre-visualisation before you write, and then you just...
Yeah, good. So planning.
Or do you have a plan that...
Do you plan much?
Yes, I do, and then I ignore it all. So pretty much. I don't plot my stories very well. If I start, I always abandon them, so I just don't waste it's too much time wasted. I do have a sense, I write a skeleton, so I guess I write the skeleton of the book, which is that I know that these are probably the main components of my story, and that will inevitably change anyway. I wrote a whole version of the things we see in the light that my editor said, nice, but really? And I had to go back and honestly admit that I had avoided a certain plot point because I was too afraid to write it, and so I had to go back. And so it's really like, for me, I don't know about you, but it's like deep sea diving. You know, you go in and you just don't know what's there, so you're just looking around and trying to figure it out, and then at one point you hit the flow and it's like, okay, I know what this story is now. and then you hit a rock again, and then you hit the flow again, and then, so yeah, I think it's important. I take a lot of notes. So I'm somebody who I'm constantly thinking about it, and I'm learning to trust that time. I'm learning to trust that it's not procrastination, it's actually research, because when you're not writing as a writer, you're terrified that you're not doing your work, and actually, yeah, right, like, but actually you need that downtime, because when you go in, it's like a tidal wave, isn't it? It's just, boom. I don't know if you can relate to that, but I try not to be prescriptive is what I'm saying. Usually I have ideas, but I'm very willing to abandon them if they're not working.
What about you, Michelle? Do you have a plan?
Yeah, no, I'm not. I don't have a plan. No, I mean, I think it's sort of, I hear writers say this over and over again, that you kind of find out what the book is about through the writing of it. But what I always do have and need is an ending. And I guess even you talk about deep sea diving, I guess for me it's the difference between, I don't really want to swim out into the ocean. It's just a bit too scary. I want a very, very long lap pool. I know I will get to that.
I like that you've taken the water metaphor and run with it. Thank you.
So I guess it's just reassuring to know I'm going to end up there, but how I get there, And I like to have something to start with. I might need it might almost be just a rhythm, like a da-da-da-da or something, to get that first sentence going. And so something at the beginning and knowing where I'm going at the end, and then there's just the middle bit.
Lucky you. I never know my ending. I always know my beginning.
Oh, there you go.
Keir, what about you in screenwriting? Do you need to be planning?
It's sort of forced upon
you
you
have
a
to.
bit more in screenwriting. I mean, if you're just writing speculatively, just typing away in the office. But if you're working with a production company, if it's at that stage, it's kind of forced upon you. To get them to buy in the first place. Right. They're looking at a pitch document, and then they'll want to see scene breakdowns, and there's so many stages before they'll press go on something that
so not so much free fall.
Yeah.
One thing we're going to have to go soon, finish up soon, but one thing I was going to ask you all is with story, what else can we do with story? Where else? We've talked about form a little bit, and we've talked about your form with Scary Monsters, and Ali Smith and some other people have really experimented with form. Have you thought about where else you can take story and what else you can do with it? Are there any other really interesting things we're yet to see, perhaps? Any one of...
These are our next works you're asking us.
Well, yes, perhaps it's your next work. Is it your next work?
No, perhaps? I don't think. I think I'll write a very, small, immersive, single, boring novel.
Okay. I don't think it will be boring. It will probably win the Man Book, or it will probably win the Orange Prize, just a few little things that Michelle de Kretser wins. What about you, Amal?
I would just say is that I think for me, and I think it's just not emphasised enough, is that all story is character. And if you don't have characters for the audience to read or follow that they want to be with for that entire journey, that's when your story will fall down. And so I think there are no limits with that. I mean, Schitt's Creek is a great example. I bring it up because I think it was so well done in terms of the character evolution.
Right. Yep.
They took four seasons or 5 seasons to take them from one type of human being to another. They didn't rush it, and not everybody has that luxury. And I think, it's just really important to realise that even plot is character. It's not, I think we get, unless you're talking about the Marvel action flicks, which are just, who even knows what they are, right? You don't even know what's going on by the end. Well, no, but they're entertainment, but I don't know. If you ask me what the storyline is, I just know there's a ring or something, and that's all I know. And I know that there's a timeline, and that everybody's going to die, and that's it. But I've lost my characters in that point because they've been overtaken by the urgency of the plot.
So for you, you can continue to experiment and have characters grow and do all these wonderful things. There's no limits.
What I'm experimenting with now is writing a book where not a lot is happening.
Okay.
But how do I keep that interesting?
Wow.
And that's terrifying for me because, in the things we see in the light, it was very eventful. I had a very clear journey for her by the end. Whereas with this book, I was talking to my editor the other day and I just said, I don't think much is happening, but a lot's happening. And she went, yep. And I just felt reassured because I don't know if you've seen those movies where they have really famous authors, which I'm not, but, they send someone because, they haven't finished their book on time. And I'm like, are you going to send someone to keep an eye on me to finish my book? And she's like, no, we don't have the resources for that. But, that sense of my worry is, like, how can you keep people engaged when it's not as active? Like, because you need activity, you need action. So how can you do that without it being overwhelming? And you sit with the character, and that's terrifying for me because I've been drilled in, especially as a screenwriter, that you just constantly have to have things happening. And it just...
So Amanda Lowry, I'm thinking, is one who was really wonderful with that. What about you, Keir?
Yeah, I think that...
Where can we go?
The discussion about form is super interesting because I think screen does have a slightly more rigid contract with the audience. There are certain expectations that people, particularly with genre, there are expectations that they want met, and if you are too loose with form, it can, the whole thing can fall apart. That's not to say there's not great examples of people that have done amazing things, but the biggest shift I'm seeing in terms of storytelling, and I don't know how I feel about this yet, but is due to technology and things like, long-form storytelling happening on things like TikTok, where you're telling a story in 40 one-minute episodes on a social media platform. So technology is actually changing the way we're telling stories in quite an amazing and scary and possibly horrifying way. But that feels like, at least in the screen context, how story is evolving into new territory.
They're even doing choose your own adventure now. So Netflix, I think, have done that.
Yeah.
They're sort of pioneering this thing where you can actually elect what you think happens next. And it's just a bit of a, overwhelming experience because you're like, I want to watch all of it. And so you end up spending 3 hours watching a half-an-hour show, you know what I mean? Because there's all these different potentials.
So story, there's no limits to story. On that note, I think we'll say thank you. But first, before we say thank you, I just want to acknowledge that, Amal, you're going to be on Stereo Stories tonight.
Yes, I am. I think I mentioned that about 5 times.
So Stereo Stories, so that should be...
and I'll be reading oracle cards before that. So if you want your little Sufi oracle wisdom card,
Fantastic.
I'll be doing that. So you can come.
And I think, but afterwards we're lucky enough to have Michelle and Amal will have their books out for signing if you're interested in buying the books and having a chat to them further along. But thank you so much for coming and being such a wonderful audience. It's been wonderful. Thank you.
And Margaret, thank you so
Thank you
much.
very
Oh,
much.
thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.